This week on Jerusalem Dateline, an exclusive interview with former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who discusses the accomplishments of the former U.S. administration and the challenges facing this one. And violence in Lebanon as the probe continues into last year's Beirut blast. Plus, palm trees sprouted from 2,000-year-old seeds. All this and more this week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Julie Stahl, filling in for Chris Mitchell. Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo played a key role in the foreign policy accomplishments of the Trump administration. He sat down with CBN News Middle East Bureau Chief Chris Mitchell in Jerusalem to discuss what he sees as some of the major foreign and domestic challenges facing the United States and Israel.
Nearly 2 months after the U.S. pullout from Afghanistan, Secretary Pompeo told CBN News how the consequences are playing out in Israel and beyond.
So I've heard over these past few days while I've been here in Israel, I've heard from many of the Israeli leaders and security establishment. They're very concerned. They're concerned not only about the increased terror risk, that there'll be room for Al-Qaeda or for ISIS or for both to grow in the region in Afghanistan, and that this will embolden Iran, but also they're worried. They're worried because they saw America execute a withdrawal from Afghanistan that can only be described as a debacle. Not only did we have 13 Americans killed, so tragically, but we still have Americans who are behind enemy lines. It made no sense to me the way the Biden administration executed that withdrawal, and I think America's credibility in the world was damaged as a result of that. I pray that we're able to get that credibility back.
One impact of the pullout seems to be a more belligerent China. How would you describe the threat of China right now?
All of these things are interconnected. Leaders around the world watch how American presidents behave. They can sense American weakness, that America's not prepared to honor the red lines that it has drawn to protect America's vital interests. And so I think what you're seeing from the Chinese Communist Party is precisely what you'd see follow from that. They're going to test, they're going to push. And the first place we're seeing this test is 150 plus aircraft flying into the air defense identification zone for Taiwan. I hope the American administration is prepared to do the right thing to support the people of Taiwan.
You've been the CIA Director, Secretary of State. What keeps you up at night?
You know, the single biggest thing that keeps me up at night today is the fact that we are teaching our kids in school things that are so deeply disconnected from the American tradition that it is incomprehensible for me to understand. Right? We now have teachers who want to tell our kids that our nation was founded on a racist idea. They want to tell children that because of their race, they may well be the powerful and the other group be the victim. This is not the America that I have known. It's not the America that I've read about. It's not the American tradition. We had a noble founding. We are the most exceptional nation in the history of civilization. And if we refuse to teach our children that, then the Republic is at risk.
Secretary, you're an evangelical Christian. You're here in Jerusalem. What does Jerusalem mean to you?
I was at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre yesterday, right, where Jesus was crucified, died, and buried, and then rose from the tomb. This is at the center of who we are as Christians, and to get to once again to walk this place is a reminder of how central Christianity is to humanity, and how important it is that as we enter public life, that we keep Christianity and our faith at the center of it, and we never fear. We are disciplined, we are true, we are tolerant of people of other faiths as well, but we know who we are as believers in Jesus Christ.
Yeah. Mr. Secretary, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, sir. It was wonderful to see you again.
In a meeting in Washington, both Israel's Foreign Minister Yair Lapid and Secretary of State Antony Blinken warned about Iran's race to get a nuclear bomb. The U.S. says it's willing to re-enter the nuclear deal with Iran, known as the JCPOA, but time is running out.
We are getting closer to a point at which returning to compliance with the JCPOA will not, in and of itself, recapture the benefits of the JCPOA.
Iran has publicly stated it wants to wipe us out. We have no intention of letting this happen.
Iranian proxy Hezbollah was at the center of violent clashes that erupted in the Lebanese capital of Beirut. The trouble is just the latest to rock the country that's teetering on the verge of collapse. The clashes broke out at a protest where supporters of Hezbollah and its allies were demonstrating against a judicial probe into last year's massive port blast. At least 6 people were killed in exchanges of gunfire involving snipers, pistols, Kalashnikovs, and rocket-propelled grenades. The trouble comes amid allegations that Hezbollah is trying to obstruct the investigation into the blast, while Hezbollah says the presiding judge is trying to politicize it. The Lebanese army restored calm to the city. Lebanon's president, Michel Aoun, vowed to hold accountable those responsible for the clashes, as well as whoever was behind last year's Beirut blast. Just days before the trouble on the streets, the country suffered a massive blackout when the state power plants ran out of fuel. Lebanon's electric grid is back online now after the army supplied fuel to 2 key power stations. But as Chris Mitchell reports, it's one more sign of a nation in trouble.
The blackout plunged Beirut, once known as the Paris of the Middle East, into the dark. For a time, car headlights became the main source of light.
We used to have electricity for an hour daily. Now it's totally cut. We're spending our time outside our homes so our children can have fun. The situation is getting worse. May God protect us as we don't know where we're heading.
The lack of power represents a crisis for hospitals, essential services, and ordinary people trying to keep their refrigerators running and food from spoiling. Last week, Jordan agreed to supply electricity to Lebanon, but that deal could take months to implement. The energy crisis is part of a larger political and economic crisis where Lebanon's currency has lost 90% of its value. Recently, these depositors stormed this bank in central Beirut after the bank blocked their money.
I'm demanding my right and my money. All my years of work were robbed. They robbed people's work and they put them in the name of their children abroad.
A new government took office recently, the first since the massive explosion in August 2020 that devastated the city of Beirut. But Israeli analyst and retired Brigadier General Asaf Orion told CBN News Lebanon is not only a failed state, but a fake state, because the terrorist group Hezbollah is the real power inside the country.
They're running the show. They allow legitimate veneer of Christians, Sunnis, and others to take part in this facade. And as long as the world buys it and keeps on paying, it will keep on rolling.
Coming up, former Secretary of State Pompeo discusses the future of the Abraham Accords and the threat of Iran. Now that the Abraham Accords has celebrated its 1-year anniversary, Israel's Knesset is moving to ensure the agreements can survive the test of time.
The establishment here at the Knesset of the Abraham Accords Caucus is the next step in solidifying the relationship between Israel and her Sunni Arab neighbors. Caucus co-chair Ruth Wasserman-Lande says leaders across Israel's political spectrum are uniting behind the accords.
And as you could see, you had people from former government, current government, the fact that this is a real national interest of the country and of the region. And I pray to God that this is just the beginning.
Bahrain's ambassador shared his country's support for expanding and protecting the accords.
It can become the mechanism that enables us, despite the differences, to put our hands together and work towards one goal: a safer, more prosperous, and secure Middle East.
The event brought together many architects of the accords, like Jared Kushner, who says the peace agreements have started a ripple effect.
It's spreading throughout the Middle East, it's spreading throughout the world. Muslims in Indonesia, Muslims in Saudi Arabia, Muslims in Malaysia, Muslims in Pakistan, they're seeing that Israel is not what they've been told it is, and they're seeing that Israelis are welcoming their Muslim brothers, and they're seeing that there's a lot that we can be doing together.
This Bahraini shares a unique perspective after working with Israelis.
This is my first visit, but it's not my first interaction with Israeli people. I'm a humanitarian, so I do a lot of work internationally, and luckily enough, I had the pleasure to meet a lot of Israelis around the world who are volunteering with me as well. And to me, they're great people.
U.S. representatives pledged support to advance the accords.
The Biden administration now continues working to expand normalization efforts and to deepen Israel's existing relationships and to bring new countries into the fold.
Former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu credited the Trump administration for changing policy towards Israel and Arab leaders.
They understood now that the road to Washington passed not through Ramallah, but through Jerusalem, because that was the American policy. They said, if you want even better relations with the United States, then make peace with Israel. So the change in American policy was critical. I have to say that without it, you could bake the cake, but you can't finish it. You can't put the topping on it without this crucial change.
Netanyahu added, while Israel and these Sunni Arab nations face a common enemy, he's optimistic about the future.
I believe that if we continue to move in this direction, and if we don't fall into yesterday's traps and the failed policy of the past, our grandchildren will look back at this moment and say that the peace of Abraham brought the sons of Abraham together.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, the Knesset, Jerusalem.
Former Secretary of State Pompeo addressed the future of the Abraham Accords as well as the threat from Iran in his interview with Chris Mitchell.
Mr. Secretary, thanks for joining us on CBN News.
Yeah, it's great to be with you again, Chris.
Tell us about the Abraham Accords. What do you see for the future?
I am still so happy that these amazing leaders, Mohammed bin Zayed in the Emirates, the Crown Prince and the leadership in Bahrain and Sudan and Morocco, and then of course Presidents Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu were able to take this bold decision and put in place this set of understandings which will make life better for people throughout the regions. I think this changed history. I don't think it's going to go back. I think the people of these nations can see that this is the rightful Jewish homeland. It ought to be recognized as such. It's not good foreign policy to have the destruction of Israel at the center of how you think about the world. The commerce, the trade, the defense work that will be done between these nations will create prosperity for people in every one of them. And I think that's why ultimately there will be many other nations that will see this as both right and righteous.
Your administration got out of the JCPOA. It seems like the Biden administration is eager to get back into it. What would be the consequences if the Biden administration renews the Iranian nuclear deal?
Yeah, you'll be that much closer to an Islamic Republic of Iran, a kleptocracy, a theocracy. You'll have a nuclear weapons program. And it may be a year, it may be 2 years before they get it, but they will have a clear, lawful pathway to a nuclear weapons program. Second thing is you'll see a wealthier Islamic Republic of Iran regime. You'll see them with more money, more resource. That means more terror, more bombs blowing up in places like Brussels and Paris. That means more militias operating inside of Iraq and Hezbollah, more well-armed. We had put real sanctions in place that were putting the Iranian regime in the difficult position about having to make hard decisions about how they were going to resource their country. This administration appears to be prepared to unlock that and give the regime billions and billions of dollars. I pray that that's not the case, and I can assure you that nations all across the Middle East feel the same way. Not only the Israelis, but the Gulf state Arabs. We had isolated Iran. The other nations were in an alliance that understood that Iran was the world's largest state sponsor of terror and that stability in the region depended on pushing back against Iran, not against Israel.
Do you see the U.S. ever helping Israel if it decides to do a military strike against Iran?
It's more than just the military alliance. It's more than just intelligence sharing. It's a central understanding of our two peoples. Right, we have a Judeo-Christian heritage in the United States. This is an important democracy in the Middle East. We have an obligation to have a deep and important relationship with the people of Israel.
Up next, sprouting date seeds from 2,000-year-old seeds bearing fruit from the time of the Bible. In the middle of Israel's Arava desert, a farming community is bringing trees back to life. One of them is already bearing fruit from the time of the Bible. This little young-looking palm tree named Judith carries an ancient heritage.
We're talking about the resurrection of 2,000-year-old plus ancient date seeds that come from the Judean desert and from Masada, and which are part of a scientific experiment.
Growing in a greenhouse for the last 9 years, Judith was recently transplanted in what Kibbutz Keturah calls the ancient Judean date orchard. Journalists even pitched in to help. She's the 5th such tree to be planted there after Methuselah, Adam, Jonah, and Hannah.
We are planting our 2nd female date tree, who was sprouted from an ancient seed. Actually, this one came from Qumran, was found in the caves, and much to our astonishment, she also sprouted.
This is Hannah behind me, the first female tree. She was planted in 2019. Pollinated by Methuselah, last year she had around 100 dates. This year she had 621 dates, and this is part of one of them. Dr. Sarah Salone, a medical doctor, started this project more than 15 years ago after becoming interested in natural medicine.
I wanted to see how medicinal the flora of Israel was and what it had been used for and so on. And then I realized that many of these species had actually disappeared. And we know what there was because it's mentioned in the Bible. The Bible is our guidebook of ancient species.
One that disappeared centuries ago was the Judean date. The date is mentioned in the Bible as one of the 7 species found in the ancient land of Israel.
Now, we see dates all the way along here, palm trees, and all the kibbutzim are growing plants, and look at the plantations on Keturah. Those date palms of modern-day Israel are modern, and they were imported after the founding of the state in the 1950s, but they're not the original date tree that grew here.
Years ago at Masada, archaeologists found a jar of those ancient date seeds.
In ancient times, the classical writers described in detail the dates of ancient Judea. Why? Because they were famous. They were big, they were sweet, they were very dry, that allowed them to be exported all over the Roman Empire, and they had medicinal qualities.
Salone obtained 5 of those original seeds and gave them to botanist Dr. Elaine Soloway. After devising a method to sprout them, Soloway has succeeded in sprouting seeds found in other places, such as the Qumran caves where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found.
I think the biggest problem is hydrating them, because if you hydrate them too quickly, you kill them, and you only get 1 crack in each seed. So far, we have 5 males and 2 females, 7 altogether. And I've tried lots of seeds, and most of them are deader than doornails.
15 years ago, the first tree Soloway sprouted was a male. They called him Methuselah after the oldest person in the Bible. CBN News got its first look 10 years ago when Methuselah was still in the lab. There are currently around 856,000 date palms growing in Israel. Soloway planted some 3,000 of them on kibbutz Keturah, where each tree produces around 350 pounds of dates a year. And Soloway and Salone are hoping eventually to add the revived Judean dates to the harvest.
We are going to be testing those dates in the future to see actually what they do and whether they differ from other commercial varieties of modern dates. So for the kibbutz, it's a big venture.
Dr. Tariq Abu Hamid, director of the Avea Institute, sees this as planting seeds from the past to bear a special kind of needed fruit for the future.
If you don't look back to the history, you will not see the future. And here we're actually planting history at the Avea Institute. We hope one day that with these trees that came from 2,000 years ago will be the hope of peace in our region.
Still ahead, the largest Byzantine winemaking factory ever found is uncovered in Israel. A sprawling winemaking factory from the Byzantine era was uncovered in southern Israel recently. Archaeologists say it's the largest known complex of its kind from that time period in the world. Israeli archaeologists uncovered this huge winemaking complex in the coastal city of Yavne.
And this area was one of the major centers of wine growing and wine production for international trade.
The Israel Antiquities Authority began this excavation here in 2019. It's a Byzantine-era industrial zone, and it's one of the largest excavations the IAA has ever carried out. Some 200 to 300 people work at the site daily. In use during the 5th and 6th centuries, the facility would have produced and marketed more than 500,000 gallons of wine each year.
It was certainly a prestigious wine. I mean, this was a wine that we know was presented during the coronations of Byzantine kings. Justin II had wine from this region, what was called Gazan wine, presented at his table during his coronations.
While the name comes from where the wine was exported, the major headline from this discovery is its size and scope.
This is what is also revolutionary in the way that we have not one single wine press somewhere in a field, but we have 5 wine presses of huge size for mass production of wine, all together in a cluster, and they're all situated within a well-planned industrial estate. So we have roads that go between the wine presses. They mirror each other in their architectural design, and they all have the possibility of having a huge quantity of wine produced in them.
Excavation director Dr. John Seligman explained how it worked.
So the grape juice would have come from behind me over here, from the treading floor, flowed through this channel and out into this area in front of me. This is what we call a filtration pit. It's the place where the grape juice was separated from the skins. That then would flow through our pipes and to either side to the collection vats. There are 3 to 4 days of fermentation in the pits. So that's the 3 and 4 days of time when they would be treading and filling the other one. Keep swapping back and forth.
The grapes would have come from surrounding vineyards, and the site had kilns for making the jars.
They have like a torpedo shape, and that was something which was known to people. Just like you know what a cola bottle looks like without having the word cola written on it.
The jars then went to one of 4 huge warehouses for fermentation.
So the aging would have taken place over a relatively short period in these large warehouses, and then the wine would be taken from here to the port and then exported abroad or drunk here in the various sites around the city.
According to Seligman, wine was often the drink of choice in those days because of the poor quality of the drinking water. Excavations here are scheduled to continue for 2 years. The site was supposed to be paved as a highway, but now the city plans to build a bridge over it to make it accessible to tourists. That's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. I'm Julie Stahl. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.